Hi, I'm Bill Wilt of Assured Research. Thanks for listening to this audio summary of our May 2026 briefing. I'll spend a few minutes hitting the highlights of our notes and hope it encourages you to open and skim the document. Our first note is on the topic of tort reform and liability costs, which we look at through the lens of the liability burden. Now, we've defined that the liability burden as calendar year liability losses by state, pardon me, divided by each state's GDP. The Bureau of Economic Analysis just within the last few weeks here in mid-April released 2025 GDP and sales by state, economic measures by state. So we had that data going back to the year 2000, and it really makes for some interesting graphs, which we think you'll enjoy from this note. As to the conclusions from our work, I'm going to simply read a few sentences from each of our observations. Nationally, the liability burden hit a resistance point in 2024 and 2025, and it stands at just over the one standard deviation mark relative to its long history, which in the note and in this graph in particular goes all the way back to the early 1970s. So it did hit a resistance point. Now, viewing the trend and distribution of both the liability burden, liability losses divided by GDP, and the liability loss ratios, it's easy to spot the strong correlation between those two variables over time. And viewed on a trend basis, there are only a few states where the liability burden hasn't grown or increased at a rate close to the national average of about 5.8% per annum over the past decade. But there are some interesting regional patterns when you look at the level of liability burden by state. For instance, the Southeast Atlantic states, the industrial Midwest, and the Northern Plains states all have lower than average liability burdens, and that translates into lower liability loss ratios. There's that content plus a lot more in this note. And we really hope that this is presented in a way that it can be really almost immediately useful to underwriters, actuaries, and claims professionals as you take stock of the national and state specific trends in liability losses. Our second note is one you might not expect from us, but we ask whether the prediction markets have utility for insurance companies. Now, we're happy to take your feedback on whether that's a good idea or simply a dumb idea. Truthfully, we would have thought the answer to that question was a coin flip when we started thinking about the idea of using prediction markets. But at the outset of the work, stumbled on a recently released report by the Federal Reserve that studied the utility of prediction markets on macroeconomic variables. They wrote, and I'm quoting here, the Cauchy implied distributions are well behaved, responsive to news, and comparable in forecasting accuracy to established benchmarks. Now, the one word you might not understand in there if you're not familiar with it is Cauchy, Kalshi, which is one of the few prediction markets that's actually regulated by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC. It's also the prediction market that we focus on in this note, where we show that in a number of different ways, a combination of their data along with thoughts on how it could be used in insurance. So for instance, and we have already written one assured comment using their data for auto insurance, there is a market, these are referred to as event contracts, that helps you understand what participants think the likely cost of gas will be over the course of the year, or the highest level of gas over the course of the year. For liability insurance, the Federal Reserve studied the market's accuracies on inflation, and as I just commented, that market information is deemed to be comparable in forecasting accuracy to long-established benchmarks. So, insofar as you see an impact between liability costs and different measures of inflation, that could very well be useful to you. There's also a tie between workers' compensation claims and the unemployment rate. And wouldn't you know, Cauchy has event contracts on the unemployment rate. Now, the list of possibilities could go on, and please know that we're not unaware of matters related to the liquidity of contracts, among other challenges. But these markets seem to be only getting bigger, and it sure seems like an interesting and potentially useful source of information, particularly with that stamp of approval, my term, not the Federal Reserve's, but their paper essentially validating the utility of the markets on macroeconomic variables. Our third note is on business development, where many will know, or in this note, we're advocating for the use of premium intensity to find economic tailwinds. Now, in the note, we define premium intensity as commercial premiums divided by industry gross output, which is akin to industry sales. Again, as I mentioned, the BEA just recently came out with GDP and GDP by industry, GDP by state, and then gross output by industry. So it's a useful measure of exposure. We relate commercial premiums to it by industry. And I think many will know that we've long advocated for an active study of the economy and how the demand for insurance is changing, and believe that those companies actively studying the economy will outperform those who are just passive about the demand for insurance and kind of reconcile themselves to growing at GDP plus a little bit. It's our hope that this note gets people thinking about the economy, maybe taking our ideas, running with them, or taking our ideas more likely and improving upon them, but maybe incorporating them into your own business planning and business development work. For our next note, we worked a little annual statement magic and developed a process that allows for the examination of different development patterns within the other liability lines. So specifically, we've teased out development patterns for commercial excess and umbrella, separately from facilities and premises, separately from personal umbrella, and separately again from D&O and E&O. Now, our work is definitely not perfect, but our hope is that it at least could serve as a straw man for those who want to use the work for benchmarking or for analyzing the data, loss development data from a cedent, or really any other purpose. And I'll just share what we wrote on the reported development patterns. We did paid as well. We wrote, personal umbrella and D&O and E&O are the fastest reporting lines across the development curve. Facilities and premises liabilities report more quickly in the early stages of development, but lose that advantage over time, ultimately exhibiting slower reporting in the later stages. Commercial excess and umbrella, by contrast, reports more slowly in the earlier periods, but develops more steadily through the middle and later years, resulting in a less pronounced tail than facilities and premises. We welcome any input, reaction, or thoughts to the extent that they can be shared on whether that's kind of folks are finding something similar. And full acknowledgement that what I just read may not be the most riveting paragraph you'll ever read, but loss development factors are relevant to just about every assessment of financial results within a company. So they matter, and we hope you find that work useful. Our final note presents a series of graphs showing the distribution of ceded loss ratios by accident year and line of business through year-end 2025. And now we think reinsurers will find this particularly interesting, both in general and perhaps for purposes of benchmarking clients. Now, for property lines, the impact of the January 1, 2023 renewal season is evident. It entirely shifted the ceded loss ratio distribution. On liability lines, our lasting impression across accident years 21 through 2023 is that if a client initially reported an unusually high ceded ultimate loss ratio, it's highly likely that has worsened quite a bit in the years subsequent. But the good news is that accident year 2024 looks to be a dividing line where the ceded loss ratio experience could have begun to show material improvement. There's more in the note, of course. Now, we also include a trend spotting section with weather data, inflation data, and more graphs from the Kalshi market, pardon me, that may help people to better understand what it is that they have to offer there. We're grateful for your interest in our work and, of course, this audio summary. Please remember that in most cases, everyone in your company can receive our work, so feel free to pass it on, and your colleagues can join our distribution list. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for your interest.